Hitler's religiosity has continually been a source of debate among would-be historians vying to understand what motivated the Third Reich and the extermination of millions of unwanted throughout Europe. Some blame the anti-Semitism and the resultant Holocaust that followed principally on Christian ideologies, while others claim the widespread persecution was manifested through neo-paganistic ideologies that had little or nothing to do with Christian theism. On a superficial level, it doesn't fare well for the latter position, as Hitler's often quoted remarks in public addresses clearly points to his belief in a personal God and his divinely inspired mandate to rid God of his enemies. Juxtaposed to this, of course, are quotations originating from private conversations which demonstrate an irate hatred for all things Christian, and so the banter goes back and forth as one side simply keeps quoting whatever remarks best serves their adopted position. Recently, I was observing an online discussion over whether American President Abraham Lincoln was an atheist, or, at best, a deist. When the suggested notion is opposed, the typical accusation brought forward is that the dissenter, typically a Christian apologist, is simply trying to claim all the great heroes of humanity as their own even when the character in question is neither religious nor Christian. Permit us our heroes, we do not deny them theirs, as Madame O'Hare would put it. To support this claim, the dissenter begins to quote some of the references to God Lincoln made in his public speeches. But to counter the notion that Lincoln was a religious man, many people take an interesting spin on the matter. Lincoln, as they would suggest, was simply using God talk as a political ploy. The reasoning is simple. You need the Christian vote, and if voters cannot relate to you or do not believe that you share the same values that they do, they are far less likely to vote for you. Individuals running for public office doom their potential presidency if they publicly profess atheistic beliefs in a predominantly Christian country, and so to give themselves the best possible chance of being elected, candidates will try to conform their public perception to one that best matches the ideals of the public majority. One example could be found in a manuscript that Lincoln intended to publish in his earlier years. In it, he detailed his arguments against the divine origins of the Bible and the Christian doctrine of salvation. A friend of his named Samuel Hill persuaded him to get rid of the manuscript. The reason, he said, was that the consequences to his future political career could be disastrous if something of that nature became public knowledge. Lincoln agreed and got rid of the manuscript, hence saving his public image and, most probably, his future presidency. This same argumentation, however, can be applied to Hitler. Think about it. Hitler came to power in a predominantly Christian country. If he was a non-Christian or if he was an anti-Christian, he would need to disguise that if he doesn't want to ruin his political career. To spread a Nazi ideology that resulted in the death of millions, he would need to employ some powerful propaganda techniques in order to manipulate the people. Both needs can be met by frequently using God talk in public speeches and publications. Within this framework, it allows us to make a prediction about the nature of the ambiguous quotations related to Hitler's religiosity. If Hitler was using God talk merely as a political ploy and was in reality either non-Christian or anti-Christian, what we would expect is that most or all of the pro-religious and pro-Christian comments would be addressed to a public audience, whereas most or all of the anti-religious and anti-Christian comments would have a private context. Conversely, if Hitler was genuinely Christian or Christian-like, what we would expect is that both private and public spheres contain positive comments. To test this hypothesis, I compiled 60 quotations of Hitler speaking on matters of God, Christianity, and religion. 30 of these quotations were said privately to individuals, while 30 quotations were made to the general public. To each quotation I assigned either a positive or negative mark in accordance with his attitude displayed within the quotation. If Hitler was fond of, referred positively to, or otherwise praised God, Christianity, religion, etc., I denoted the comment as pro. And conversely, if the comment showed seething hatred, contempt, or dismissal of the aforementioned, I denoted it as anti. Additionally, I also marked down whether the quote had a public context or a private one, and the results will be shown graphically in a couple of minutes. There are three primary sources for these quotations. The first was from public speeches made by Adolf Hitler to the general population, and of course that source is public. The second source was Hitler's publication My Struggle, and anything found within that book I labeled as public. Why? Two reasons. The first is that, well, it's a publication, hence public. But the second reason is that Hitler used Mein Kampf as a political exposition of his ideology, and continually encouraged the propagation of the ideas contained within that book to the general public. Not only was Mein Kampf a must-have on the bookshelf, but Hitler, for example, also gave the book away as a gift to newlywed couples throughout Germany, as well as to soldiers fighting on the front lines. It was clear that Hitler wanted the public to be exposed to the contents of that book and continually encouraged the consumption of the material right up until his death. The third source of quotations are from a series of private conversations Hitler had with his closest associates, generals, and other acquaintances published in what is now known as Hitler's Table Talks. For the purpose of propriety, or perhaps for the purpose of completeness, an attending secretary would write down the private conversations Hitler had with others within his office and bunkers. These write-ups were then filed away and most likely never seen again until long after the war was over, when they were compiled and published. Why did they document these conversations if they were most likely never to be seen again? Well, two reasons. The first is that Hitler thought that there could possibly be some future propagandic or blackmail value in recording some of these conversations with certain individuals. The second is simply because they're German. They're efficient and they like to document everything. Given the context by which these documents were produced, any quotation from this general source is considered private. For the purpose of transparency, I listed all the quotations at the end of the video along with a rudimentary source, my interpretation of whether it was pro or anti, and whether it was private or public. All information along with a grand plethora of other resources can be found at the nazi.org.uk website. Any spelling mistakes are my own. I do this so you know exactly what I evaluated and the conclusions of my evaluation, and additionally just in case for some odd reason my results are horribly skewed. If you have evidence that the conclusions I made are either erroneous, either as a misinterpretation of the evidence presented or because of the external evidence that was omitted, please post your objections in the form of a video response. So here are the results. A total of 60 statements were examined, 30 of them private and 30 of them public. It was found that all 30 public statements were positive with respect to religious practice, Christianity, God, and/or church. Of the 30 private statements, all but 3 were against the aforementioned. Of the 3 exceptions, 2 of them were inconclusive and 1 of them was positive. These results clearly support the hypothesis that Hitler used Christian God talk as a political ploy to gain followers, and that, contrary to those who would assert that he was Christian, he secretly possessed strong anti-Christian sentiments. Now, you may ask, what was the one positive private statement? Well, it was a statement Hitler made in 1941 to a general named Gerhard Engel, which read, "I am now as before a Catholic and will always remain so." This quotation was not from Table Talks, but from an external reference. Now, first off, I have no idea who this Gerhard Engel was or what context this quotation was made. It is, however, certainly contradicted by multiple other statements made within the same time period that showed an irate contempt of Catholicism and Christianity. Why this statement was made, I don't know. But if I were to idly speculate, I would suggest that perhaps this General Engel was himself Catholic, and to resolve a possible contention Hitler had with him, Hitler attempted to forge common ground by appealing to common religion. It was no secret that there was a great deal of contention between Hitler and a number of his senior officers, and perhaps Hitler may have commonly appealed to such things as common religion in order to help alleviate those contentions and dissuade open acts of treachery. This is, of course, mere speculation, but I would certainly be interested in better knowing the context to which this statement was made. Overall, the overwhelming number of private statements Hitler made against all forms of Christianity and God belief support the hypothesis that Hitler was merely using God talk in public speeches to manipulate the German voting populations into electing the Nazi Party. One question that does remain unanswered, however, is whether or not Hitler used to be Christian in his earlier political career, but then deconverted later on in the 1930s and 40s. Table Talks only documents his private thoughts starting in the 1940s, and so the only way we could truly know if he was an anti-Christian throughout his career, or anti-Christian only later in life, would be to examine private thoughts that existed prior to 1940. Since Hitler kept no diary, and since such documentation was not performed prior to 1940, I do not believe this question can be answered. There is, however, one question that we can explore. If Hitler wasn't Christian, what was he? Well, no definitive answer can be provided. In the next segment, I'll suggest 3 different models that might help us progress towards understanding what exactly he believed. I'll see you there at part 2.